I'm having another sort of dilemma where I want to record something brief and I have no idea whether I should attach it to something longer or just post it on its own. I'll figure it out once I watch it back, but I need to expand on the video. I don't know if it's going to be the last video before this one or if it's going to be a couple of videos in between it, but in one of the videos that I've already uploaded, I talked about my own alternative theory of achievement. And those kinds of things don't only apply to achievement, they should apply to enjoyment. And once again, it's one of those things that I didn't really internalize until a few years ago. And specifically when it comes to stand-up comedy, I didn't fully internalize until very recently, I think a few months ago. Because I was thinking about, they're doing these top 10, top 100 stand-up comic type rundown lists, and I disagree with so many of them. And I started thinking about, well, what is it exactly that makes me disagree with the rank ordering as presented by one of these comedian enthusiast style communities? So Ricky Gervais is often ranked community after community very highly. And I remember enjoying Ricky Gervais stand-up, but also being left fairly annoyed. And so I've done a long catch-up on his specials as well as those Golden Globe or Academy Award winning, well, whatever he hosted, where he took the piss out of all the attendees and was given all kinds of credit for. I always forget what those ceremonial things, award shows are called, whether it's Golden Globes or whatever else. But he did that for a good number of years in the early and mid 2010s. And that's where I think he gained most of his credit. So I went back and I rewatched all that. I rewatched some of his specials. And it finally crystallized for me why he's always left, though he's not unenjoyable by any means, he's always left a certain sour taste in my mouth. And then certainly seeing Sam Harris start a new podcast with him where the two of them are just... In the past I've called Sam Harris a borderline infotainer when I was writing about everyone needing to pick a lane. So you either optimize for insight or you optimize for impact, but you don't try to do both as a balance act. You freaking stick with one. You're either a public reasoner who just doesn't care about pushing your message forward, right? So you're an inquirer. You're just a sort of classic adaptation of the public intellectual. You don't really care about how your contributions to public discourse impact the world because you're not trying to do a balance act. You're just optimizing for one, and as a public intellectual, you're supposed to optimize for insight and pay 0% attention to impact. And so I've ragged on Harris in the past for turning into, I said, borderline infotainer. But then him having opened up this podcast with Ricky Gervais, I think it's called Absolutely Mental, them starting this podcast, then yeah, it's just scratch borderline. He is now a full-blown infotainer, and it's something that someone should point out and say that he can do better. If you look at his old literature, what he's written about, the references, passages, all kinds of interesting little tidbits in his old books that he's not expanding on now himself, but he's referenced Daniel Kahneman, he's referenced the rundown of these behavioral economists and all these people whose works are so neglected. And instead of expanding on that with a new book, like what does he do? Well, he does podcasts, and then he opens up a new podcast that's even more lowbrow because his co-podcast star is Ricky Gervais. So no longer borderline infotainer, now full-blown infotainer, under the guise of like improving the world, because we're making this accessible to the everyday person, under the guise of improving the world. It's like we should do the opposite. He should make his content as difficult as possible, even if it reaches far fewer people, because then you're just doing the keep it simple stupid. And that's not befitting of a public intellectual. And we shouldn't have changed our view of what a public intellectual is for the current day just because we think there needs to be some sort of a pipeline. Like, a public intellectual needs not only to make sense to a very narrow group that are capable of understanding him if he is domain specific, but no, it needs to also, beyond making sense, make the world a better place by not alienating the everyman, not using like technical jargon and stuff like that. And the older I get, the more I see that that's a fucking problem. Everyone needs to pick a lane. And someone who starts out publishing the sort of books Harris did, referencing intellectual after intellectual who's done, going back to the 70s, very revolutionary work in economics, having branched out in its own subcategory of economics called behavioral economics. Like, you read Harris's old books, they're littered with passages, references to this old stuff. And so just this complete negation of that in the current incarnation of Harris, so that he can be more mass friendly, is just leaves a complete sour taste in your mouth. And not because of the grifter accusations, just because, like, he can't figure it out that himself, that he will water down both his aims if he tries to do the balance act. So you have to sacrifice one of the two aims. And I think Gervais has been that sort of negative influence on him, and it just crystallized because I see this podcast now that the two of them are doing that is so incredibly watered down, but it gets heaps of praise because they are funny. And yeah, they're not unfunny, but should public intellectuals spend any amount of time trying to be funny in public? No. You should devote 100% of their time to making as much sense as possible. And also, there's a kind of problem with trying to be funny in public, and it endears you to your audience. And the moment you endear yourself to your audience, odds are you're going to endear yourself to people who also aren't, who are also tend to criticize you, and who might then view your non-comedic output more generously than they would have. And so this is like one of the reasons why actually I came to understand that philosophers, the fact that they're so private, so intensely private, I had an issue with that. I actually thought they should put their personalities out there and try to be, maybe not entertaining, but try to be charismatic and stuff like that. It's like, no. It makes perfect sense that they're not doing that, that they are as bulwarked from the rest of the world as possible, because then the readers and their cohorts who read them are going to view their content, their writings, in as unbiased a way as possible. Because there's no kind of a pull because of some characterological trait or any other kind of endearing trait. They're just robotic. And that's the best way to filter out any sort of non-rigorous evaluation of one's output. And the moment you're doing a balance act with borderline comic, borderline infotainer, borderline something, as well as serious commentator and public reasoner, that's it. You ought to be disqualified. So because they started that podcast together, and I think it's been now 50-50. There's more podcasts released. The Absolutely Mental podcast has more episodes released in that narrow span of time than his regular podcast. Yeah, that's a kind of bad showing. My hope was that he would release fewer, even his regular podcast that's meant to be serious intellectual. My hope was that he would release fewer of those, so that he can go back to writing a book. Hasn't published as a solo writer, solo author. He hasn't published a book since 2014. And so just starting a second podcast means just one step away from publishing that solo book. So anyway, I don't want to turn this into a Sam Harris rant. I want to turn this into what I started talking about initially, and that is, just as I talked about an alternative theory of achievement, we all need to think more critically and clearly about our own idiosyncratic theories of enjoyment. So it's like, why is it that even though I probably laugh per sentence spoken, or maybe like an internal laugh, not a literal LOL, but like an internal snicker or something like that, per sentence spoken, I probably do that more when I watch a Ricky Gervais stand-up. But nonetheless, I don't enjoy Ricky Gervais as a stand-up comedian anywhere near as much as I enjoy someone like Bill Hicks. Even though Bill Hicks almost never makes me even halfway chuckle, but he's nonetheless far more enjoyable as a performer, and as a performer that I would bill under stand-up comedy. Not anything else, but stand-up comedy. Now, how can that make sense? That doesn't make sense if you have to abide by the sort of measure of what makes a stand-up comedian the best stand-up comedian, and that is just how often do they make you laugh. But that's a mistake. Stand-up comedy ought to be enjoyed beyond the laugh metric. Ricky Gervais, he points out absurdities and other kinds of things in the world that someone should definitely point out. But as he's doing it, even though he does a good job of it, there's that kind of giddiness the whole way through. And it doesn't only come out in the stand-up performances, it comes out in his podcasting. He's got the solo podcast, he's got the podcast with Harris, and he is the type of person who, he does notice things that make no sense and that are absurd and increasingly absurd about the world, and he does a good job explaining it, but at the end of the day, he's the sort of person that I think enjoys, on some level enjoys, that the world is as nonsensical as it is. He doesn't truly begrudge people for contributing to the nonsense of the world. Bill Hicks was the polar opposite of that. You felt that when Bill Hicks delivered a rant, he genuinely was frustrated with the fact that the people he was ragging on, the culture that he was ragging on, or something else that he was truly passionately opposed to, this was not performative anger. The man was genuinely frustrated with the culture that he found himself surrounded by. And so he was nowhere near as funny per sentence spoken, per segment, or hell, per special. He was nowhere near as good at getting me to either chuckle or occasionally even literally laugh out loud. But that doesn't matter. That should not dictate how we rank order comedians. It should be the whole package. Just how much did you enjoy the presentation from A to Z, not just at the level of laughter, but at the level of what the person stands for and what the person is rightly furious about. And you won't find two more contrasting figures than Bill Hicks and Ricky Gervais. Gervais, I think at the end of the day, on some level, likes the fact that the world doesn't make sense. Not necessarily because it helps him line up his pocket, but you get that type of person every now and then. You rant about something that makes no sense. This has happened to me in past friendships as well as when I rant about something at work, and the person doesn't object to anything you're saying, but at the end of the day, they are at ease. Because it's also funny in that absurd way, they are at ease with it, and there is no anger. Whereas I can both appreciate something funny about the fact that the world is as absurd as it is, but that does not deduct from my being furious with it and from my believing that it ought to change ASAP. I felt Bill Hicks was that way as well. I felt that Bill Hicks's anger, if he could just wave a magic wand and change the world so that it's less absurd, less nonsensical, even if it hurts his stand-up, he would have done it. I'm not sure if Ricky Gervais would have done it. I'm not sure if this recent crop of heavily praised mainstream stand-up comics would do it. I don't think Bill Burr would do it. Bill Burr annoys me for different reasons, but it's never really been for his giddiness. Like, he has an anger problem, but I still think at the end of the day, if he can just wave the magic wand, he wouldn't do it. Even though it makes him as close as Bill Hicks was angry, Bill Burr was fairly close when it comes to his most anger-inducing bits. But it wasn't, he wouldn't, I don't trust that he would have been as angry when he does get angry as Hicks was, such that he would wave a magic wand to rid the world of the nonsense. So yeah. Plus, the old school comics knew that there was a charm to not being overexposed. Maybe that's me giving them a bit too much credit. Maybe if the technology had been what it is right now, they would have disgustingly overexposed themselves the way all these current crop of comics do, with not just podcasts once a week, but some of them do multiple podcasts once a week, and you kind of want to stay on top of it because there are nuggets of gold when they're just doing the Q&As and stuff like that. 95% of it is just unamusing. But see, they think that they get so much praise from their fanatical supporters that just love every word that comes out of their mouth, that they can't see how they're cheapening themselves by being that overexposed. And I'd like to think that even if the technology had been around decades ago, someone like Hicks would have known, hey, I'm not gonna do a podcast even once a month, let alone like twice a week, because I know that the overexposure effect takes away a certain kind of charm. You wanna leave the audience wanting more. You don't want to have your stand-up run too long, and you certainly don't want to supplement your stand-up with a bunch of podcasts where you are kind of just doing stand-up, except you're not doing it in an auditorium. you're doing it solo without the laughs, but it's still really the same thing. And it's just so unfortunate that as talented as the current crop of stand-up comedians are, they can't figure out that they're just cheapening themselves. And maybe no one's figured it out yet, but I think give it enough time and we'll see that. And it's also a problem with intellectuals, I would say. Intellectuals don't need to put out nearly as much content as they do. I've ranted about this before. I think the problem really is, it goes all the way back to talk radio. The fact that someone thought any talk radio personality was worth listening to more than just kind of popping in on them once every few months to see if they're just doing the same old autopilot things. No, you had talk radio after talk radio personality be a sort of ideological powerhouse, even though they were on autopilot. Because there's really is just that many people who, as long as you make them feel like there's a kind of flattery to their ideology, the fact that there is a kind of momentum, if you listen to any given powerhouse in terms of talk radio, from Limbaugh to Tom Hartman to everyone in between, one thing that they do a wonderful job at is making you think that your beliefs have a certain kind of momentum to them, either at the level of movement or at the level of truth tracking. But all I see is autopilot, day in and day out. And just as we understand that it is unbecoming of an intellectual to fall into those kinds of bad epistemic habits, we should also hold our current crop of stand-up comedians to the same standard. And if they overindulge in podcasting or any other kind of audience interaction between their specials, I'm not saying no one should ever tweet. If they're a stand-up comic, they can tweet, but for fuck's sakes, tweet a couple of times a week, and that's enough. And leave everything else for the stand-up special, so that it can be genuinely special, as opposed to just being a retread of what you've already done in all these other avenues, be it social media or something else. Interviews, I mean, Bill Burr is just the biggest interview whore I've ever seen, I think. I mean, there is no interview that he turns down if you really look at just how many different shows he appears on top of having a podcast twice a week. He's an amusing guy, but he's nowhere near that amusing. And it's just amazing that no one shakes him and says, hey, sooner or later, it's not just going to be people like me who are going to notice that this cheapens you. It's going to be a larger and larger chunk of the people who follow you and who want to see everything you do, because there are always nuggets of gold, but it's been how many years now? Over 5 years since I regularly listened to his podcast, because he just kept doing it twice a week. And I know I'm missing some good stuff by never listening to it anymore, but if it's on the whole a time sink, I will be willing to miss out on those golden bits, because also all the other stuff is just not worth it. So the main point is, just as you ought to have your own theory of achievement that's not tracked by any external formalized kind of institutional standard, likewise you ought to think more critically about your own theory of enjoyment. And you should not rank a comedian like Ricky Gervais higher than a comedian like Bill Hicks simply because Gervais may make you laugh more, internally or externally laugh more. There's other things that are critical, integral to what makes a stand-up comic one superior to another. And it is just a general takeaway. Just that lack of a sour taste in your mouth as a takeaway that you may get after watching a Hicks special, because his anger is genuine, whereas Gervais is, you really do get the sense that he's just on a level, he likes the fact that the world is as nonsensical as it is. Well, apparently I'm going to bring it back to the SEP because I just can't resist it. I like this entry on fitting attitude, theories of value. Not so crazy about this part, but I like the fact that they do an in-depth literature overview of what it means to take a fitting versus non-fitting or ill-fitting attitude toward a given object. It ties into, I think, pretty significantly, it ties into what I said about theory of enjoyment, but this is probably a better way to put it, taking a fitting attitude. So if a routine, a comedy routine, for example, is more intriguing but less funny, whereas another one is less intriguing but more funny, or let's say funny in a crass way, resonates with you, it makes you laugh, but its funniness is kind of crass, right? You should still rate the former as superior on comedic grounds, because comedy overlaps with intrigue to an extent, or anger, or stuff like that. So overall, we can say that is maybe better put in terms of what type of an attitude you take toward comedy as opposed to theory of enjoyment. Either works, but there's a former long-standing literature in terms of referring to it as fitting attitudes. Fitting attitude, FA theories propose to analyze value, I'm not crazy about that, or some limited range of values. Okay, well, the more limited, the better, because we can have this debate without stepping into any sort of goo, value goo, because I really do believe, especially if we're talking intrinsic value / disvalue, it shouldn't be connected to attitudes. Doesn't mean that thinking about what it means to have a fitting versus non-fitting attitude towards something doesn't mean that that's a completely uninteresting debate. It is interesting in its own right. It just shouldn't be intermingled with intrinsic value, even for a value pluralist, I believe. In terms of evaluative attitudes, endorse this fitting or alternatively as appropriate, correct, merited, proper, rational, or warranted. FA theories come in both cognitivist and non-cognitivist versions and can be given either a realist or quasi-realist gloss. Now, why would I resist this part? Well, number one, I think there's all kinds of other things that pluralize intrinsic value to the point where fitting attitudes would really just crowd out things that we already have a hard enough time measuring. Second of all, an attitude can be fitting and unfortunate, or it can be ill-fitting and extremely fortunate. Take things like guilt, take things like regret done in excess, right? So suppose that you're just, you did something, you're guilt-ridden all the time, and you can't function anymore. The guilt is paralyzing. It's not productive in any sense, and it ruins your life, it ruins the lives of people you know, you care about, they're concerned about you. Things like regret. I think I read once that Derek Parfit actually used this example where he used a person who was just so paralyzed with regret over something, some historical injustice, like the slave labor that went into the building of the pyramids. That doesn't mean that the attitude of regret towards something like that, the fact that all kinds of slave labor was used, that doesn't mean that it's not truly regretful, right? That you shouldn't regret the fact that so much of our history is plagued with these atrocities. It makes perfect sense to have that be as your attitude. Or if you did something terrible, to be really that guilty. But if it makes you paralyzed, then we can still, at the same time, while characterizing it as a fitting attitude, we can call it unfortunate. And at the end of the day, the fortunateness to unfortunateness trumps fitting versus unfitting if we're going to say what is truly a bearer of intrinsic value / disvalue, then we're going to have to make it fortunate before fitting. The fortunateness takes precedence. And that recognition would have to hold true in all futures for this world, in all possible worlds, whether they're nearby or far away possible worlds. There's nothing, unlike with normal ethical discourse, where I would say the best case for pluralism in value is if you satisfy the criteria of one non-pluralistic theory perfectly, and you hold that satisfaction fixed, it's not as if some other theory becomes unintelligible. Like, so let's suppose that we're going with a hedonic notion of what it means. Like all experiences are the only bearers of intrinsic value and disvalue. And so say you just satisfy that perfectly, right? So it wouldn't become the case that we would just suddenly find it unintelligible, the difference between being a promise keeper and a promise breaker. It wouldn't just become morally unintelligible that this matters simply because we have guaranteed that hedonic criteria would be satisfied perfectly, right? Or some other kind of criteria. We can just use any non-pluralistic criteria to demonstrate this point. And just say once you have a clause that says it is perfectly satisfied from here on out, all these other concerns that fall outside the non-pluralistic theory owing to some other theory, right? You wouldn't just find it
incoherent or unintelligible to care about that sort of thing. I think promise breaking versus keeping is a decent go-to example, but we can use a lot of examples. That can apply even if the criteria is imperfectly satisfied. If there's just a difference that entails a slightly less pleasant outcome for a given individual. Not an unpleasant outcome, but a slightly less pleasant outcome as a result of more promise keeping in the world as a result, or in place of less promise keeping. But see, when it comes to fitting attitudes, that can never actually be the case. The fittingness is necessarily piggybacking on fortunateness, or is just completely disconnected. But nonetheless, it is fascinating to look into, just as certain other things. So just as, for example, it can be a component of aesthetic value. And to see how such a connection can be cashed out, this entry on the concept of the aesthetic can go down to all kinds of things: aesthetic objects, aesthetic judgment, aesthetic attitude. There's also one on experience, but if you want to connect it to attitudes, Kant has written about it, Schopenhauer has written about it to a great extent. So that's a bit of an FYI. Otherwise, I'm wrapping this up. I'm not reading from it. Take too long. I wanted this to be shorter as it is. It ran too long.